The Flowers of Romance is the third studio album by English experimental rock band Public Image Ltd. Released on 10 April 1981 by record label Virgin. The first studio album recorded since the departure of founding bassist Jah Wobble. The Flowers of Romance found Pill delving further into an experimental sound. Flowers was recorded mainly by singer John Lydon and guitarist Keith Levene, both of whom made heavy use of percussion and various tape and processing effects. Recording began at the Manor Studio in Shipton on Cherwell, England, with 2 weeks booked around early October 1980. Only one album track was recorded towards the end of these sessions, Jaime's Hymn. The band also recorded joke versions of Twist and Shout and Johnny Remember Me, which remain unreleased. Drummer Martin Atkins, who visited the band towards the end of these sessions, possibly recorded the drums to Home Is Where the Heart Is during his visit, which became the B-side of Pill's Flowers of Romance single the following year. Home Is Where the Heart Is was then mixed at Townhouse Studios. During this mixing session, producer Steve Lillywhite was dropped and replaced by Nick Lune, who was enlisted to co-produce the album. The rest of the album was recorded at Townhouse Studios in London, with 2 weeks booked around late October, early November 1980. Drummer Martin Atkins was hired for the sessions and also contributed to the songwriting, and left on 31 October 1980 to play a gig in New York City with his band Brian Brain the following day. Unreleased songs which didn't make it on the album were Vampire and Wood Nymphs. A final studio session was added a few weeks later around early December 1980 at Townhouse Studios to remix the proposed single, Flowers of Romance, and record a few overdubs. Content. The title of the album makes reference to the Flowers of Romance, an early punk band of which Keith Levene, as well as Sid Vicious, was a member. The Flowers of Romance was also the title of an early Sex Pistols song. The cover photograph is of the band's videographer, Jeanette Lee. Music. The album is largely centered on percussion, and Levene has described it as probably the least commercial record ever delivered to a record company. Similarly, the Trouser Press Record Guide states that the music is so severe as to lend credence to a record executive's statement that The Flowers of Romance is one of the most uncommercial records ever made, at least within a pop context. Simon Reynolds has described the album as highly experimental and preoccupied with moving beyond the defining standards of rock music, subsequently making it a pioneering post-rock record. Occasional drummer Martin Atkins played on 3 songs, while band members Levene and John Lydon handled percussion duties on the other tracks. 1. Under the House actually has both Levene and Atkins playing dual drum lines. The prominent and heavily processed drum sound was influenced by Peter Gabriel's third album, on which engineer Hugh Padgham had processed Phil Collins' drums. Collins, in turn, was so impressed with the sound on The Flowers of Romance that he hired the album's engineer, Nick Lune, to reproduce the sound for his own projects. Throughout the album, musique concrete sounds, such as amplified wristwatches, reversed piano and televised opera, weave in and out of the mix. Producer Nick Lune recalls, on For Enclosed Walls, for instance, we placed Martin's Mickey Mouse pocket watch on a floor tom, so it would resonate and have more tone. Then I added 2 harmonizers with a 15-second delay fed back on themselves. 1 paned left, 1 right. I recorded about 7 minutes of it ticking away. Quote, we also had an AMS digital sampler one of the first digital devices ever available. One day Martin played a drum groove and I pushed loop lock and tried to make a perfect loop. The AMS was so primitive you couldn't actually edit it to get it in time. So I randomly kept locking in different beats as he played them, till I got one that sounded cool. That loop became the song, track 8. It's actually out of time, but somehow it grooves. Quote, vocalist John Lydon contributed Stro violin and saxophone, though he was not known to be trained on any particular instrument. And, according to a Rolling Stone article about the album, simply banged on anything handy for percussion, including the face of a banjo on Finnegan. Keith Levene's innovative guitar style was stretched even further through the use of reverse tapes and trebly distortion, and his synthesizers drone and burble throughout the album. Several songs, for example, For Enclosed Walls and Finnegan, have a Middle Eastern feel. Bass player Jah Wobble had left the group before The Flowers of Romance was recorded, so Keith Levene played bass on track 8 and Banging the Door, the only two tracks to feature the instrument. Regarding the track Finnegan, Lydon notes, "It's not Moroccan, it's Renaissance, early English and French, 15th century. That's what I've been listening to a lot. That's real traditional English music." Keith Levene recounts, "There's a bit of backwards guitar. There also is a banjo with 3 strings missing. And he, Lydon, was hitting it with something that was hanging off the banjo, 'cause sick. It made that noise. That was used on Finnegan. He was annoying me all the time making that noise. Then he laid down a track making that noise. Then the next thing I know is this fucking great track, called Finnegan. It's horrible really, but it's really good the way it comes out." Quote, regarding Flowers of Romance, Lydon comments, "The romance referred to is not being romantic, but alludes to people romanticizing over past events with their memories. What I'm on about is that I wanted to move on and carry on with trying to create new things." Levene recounts that Lydon bowed the bass on the track. Atkins drums on the track. On Under the House, Lydon claims, "I wrote that after I saw a ghost. It was at the manor. I'd seen a few things I didn't like. I ended up sleeping in the coal shed. I couldn't bear it in the house any longer. When a place is haunted there's an intensity which is insufferable." Lune recounts, "Again, Martin laid down the beat. Then we overdubbed the toms and doubled them with harmonizers. A trick used a few times on this record. Having grown up in the south of Spain, I was really influenced by Spanish gypsy music, flamenco. And I don't mean the tacky touristy type. I kept hearing that kind of clapping. So after explaining what I meant, we did it and added a simple delay to get that effect of 2 clappers playing off each other. The operatic wailing in the background is exactly that. There was an opera on TV while we were playing the song back in the control room. I thought the combination sounded so cool. I put a mic onto the TV speaker and recorded it to tape randomly till it made some sense. Once the track had some kind of shape, John went out and sang on it." Quote, regarding Jaime's hymn, Levene recounts, "There was this weird bamboo instrument that I used on Jaime's hymn. Richard Branson had gotten some in Bali and gave me one of these things. I had been offered to make this film soundtrack for Wolfen. Director Michael Wadley said, 'This is how wolves feed in the dark. This is the plot of the movie. What I need is an urban jungle sound.' So I came up with Jaime's hymn as my pilot for the score for the movie. I had it in the bag and Wadley loved it. I really wish I'd done the movie." Quote, "We were booked into the manor for 10 days. And it was like we knew we were doing a new album and we didn't do anything for days. We couldn't do anything. It was like this horrible mental block. After wasting 7 days of being weighted on hand and foot. Just being real lazy cunts. We were really trying but nothing was happening. It was something to do with the manner as well. We did get one track down, Jaime's Hymn. That was the first definite solid thing we got laid down. I think we could do a service to a film. Like with this Michael Wadley thing. We wanted to go right down to a bottle banging on the table, the whole lot. Not just the music but sounds. But then Tom Waits and other people came into it. And it wasn't what we had in mind. Quote, Lydon recounts, quote, Michael Wadley offered us the chance to do a soundtrack. I mean, who wouldn't want an opportunity like that? The clips we saw were really excellent. Originally Wadley wanted us to write music to suit the atmosphere. It's about wolves and killing people. And that suited us fine, of course. Quote, I thought what Keith did with the music was so good there was no point in me singing over it. Leave it alone, I said. All I could do was insult Keith with the title. Quote, according to Lydon, Banging the Door came about as a rant against the fans who found out my address in London and used to come around every night, banging away on the door and shouting, Johnny, Johnny, through the letterbox. Nearly drove me mad. Quote, in a 1980 interview with The Face, he comments, it's much, much worse than it was in the days of the Sex Pistols. I've even had them pitching their tents on my front doorstep. I just don't let any of them in anymore. I just don't answer the door. Keith Levene. Martin played the drums and I played the bass. Then I added synth to that. Nick Lune. Keith was very into these synthesizer boxes that plugged into each other with little red cables. I think it was made by Roland. It was a bit like the giant Moog synth that Kraftwerk used. Only in miniature. You can hear it on Banging the Door. It sounds like an evil giant frog. Quote, regarding Go Back, Lydon commented in the NME in 1981. London's getting very, very fascist and I don't like it at all. Go Back was written about that. About London and tedium and right-wing groups. It's pathetic. People wallow in misery and accept anything. Have a cup of tea. Good days ahead. That's just the way things are going in this country. You can't afford to pretend it's not happening. Keith Levene. I only use guitar on one track called Go Back. And it's a great little guitar line. It's turned out to be a funky track actually. Quote, he also played drums on the track. Regarding Francis Massacre, Lydon commented, for me the song just sums up the way I felt when I was in Mountjoy Prison in October 1980. Grating noises. AAARGH. Let Me Out. Single quote. Release. The Flowers of Romance was released on the 10th of April 1981 by record label Virgin. Andy Kellman of AllMusic wrote, stark and minimal are taken to daring lengths. So it's no surprise that Virgin initially balked at issuing the heavily percussive record. Quote, Flowers of Romance was released as the album's sole single in March 1981, reaching number 24 in the UK singles chart. This featured a different mix from the album version. According to producer Lune, he went back to the studio a month later with Keith and John to remix the song for single release, which is a much better mix. The 12-inch version of the single included an instrumental version of the lead track and Home Is Where the Heart Is, originally played on the Metal Box tour, with Atkins on drums and Levene again contributing bass, with help from tape loops. Reception. NME named it the 15th best album of the year. Reviewing the album in 2003, Chris Smith of Stylist described the album as a dark, Spartan affair, one that is decidedly not for all tastes. But 22 years later, There's nothing quite like it. It may not offer the kinetic glamour of Remain in light of the gleeful spazziness of the contortions, but I believe this to be one of the most interesting records produced in the fallout of punk. Aaron Hemphill of Liar's fame wrote an article for The Guardian on the album, calling it a forgotten classic, and an inspiration behind their change of sound. Kurt Cobain cited the album as one of his favorites, including it at number 42 on his handwritten list of his 50 favorite albums of all time. In an interview with Spin in 1993, he comments that the music on it is totally uncompromising, but it works somehow. Phil Collins was apparently so impressed by the album's sound that he plundered its producer, Nick Launay, for his debut album. Track listing. All tracks written by John Lydon and Keith Levene except where noted. Personnel. Public Image Ltd. John Lydon, vocals, violin, saxophone, percussion. Keith Levene, guitar, bass, piano, cello, synthesizer, percussion, drums on Under the House and Go Back. Martin Atkins, drums on For Enclosed Walls, Under the House, Banging the Door, and uncredited on Flowers of Romance. Synthesizer on Banging the Door. Technical. Nick Launay. Engineering. Charts. United Kingdom. The Flowers of Romance entered the UK Albums Chart, where it stayed for 5 weeks and reached number 11 on the 18th of April 1981. The single, The Flowers of Romance, entered the UK Top 75, where it stayed for 7 weeks and reached number 24 on the 4th of April 1981. Other countries. In New Zealand, The Flowers of Romance entered the Albums Chart, where it stayed for 6 weeks and reached number 33 on the 31st of May 1981. The Flowers of Romance at Discogs. List of releases.